Douglas Reeves had never been the type to rattle easily. His work required patience, precision, and an almost obsessive attention to detail traits that had served him well in his years restoring historic buildings, where the wrong choice of material could erase a century of craftsmanship. He had spent his career breathing life back into structures others had long abandoned, meticulously peeling away layers of neglect to uncover something worth preserving. It was this deep respect for history that had drawn him to the house on Willow Lane, a sprawling Victorian with intricate woodwork and stained glass windows that hinted at the grandeur it once held. The house had been sitting vacant for years, its previous owner having left under vague circumstances, and though its bones were strong, time had not been kind to it. The porch sagged, the pipes were rusted, and the roof needed more than just a few patches. But Douglas didn't mind the work. In fact, he welcomed it. He had never been interested in sleek, modern homes with lifeless symmetry. He preferred places with character, places that had stories to tell. And yet, from the moment he moved in, it became clear that his presence was unwelcome. At first, the unease was subtle, nothing more than a sense that he was being watched. The street was quiet, lined with homes that all seemed to share a uniform perfection: fresh coats of paint, neatly trimmed hedges, identical mailboxes standing like sentinels at the edge of each driveway. The residents were polite, but their politeness carried an edge, a sort of forced civility that suggested he was tolerated rather than accepted. None more so than Karen LeMay, the self-appointed guardian of neighborhood order. She had introduced herself within hours of his arrival, standing at the edge of his porch with a carefully composed smile and a bottle of wine that felt more like a peace offering than a gift. She was friendly in the way people were when they were trying to decide if you were a threat, her questions pointed yet wrapped in a thin veneer of politeness. How long had he planned to stay? Was he aware of the neighborhood guidelines? Had he considered repainting the house a more fitting color? The way she spoke, it was as if the house did not truly belong to him but rather to the community, and he was merely its latest custodian. At first he brushed it off as nosy neighbor behavior, the kind of meddling that came with living in any established neighborhood. But soon, the interference escalated. Notes began appearing in his mailbox, typed in the same generic font, unsigned yet unmistakable in their tone. Your renovations are disrupting the harmony of the street. This house has a legacy. Tread carefully. Some things are better left untouched. They were not threats. Not exactly, but they carried a quiet authority that unsettled him. Contractors he hired would suddenly cancel without explanation. Calls to the city for permits would be met with delays and missing paperwork. Even the most routine repairs, fixing the fence, replacing outdated plumbing, were met with complaints from the neighborhood board, which, unsurprisingly, Karen chaired. It was clear that this was not just about one man restoring an old house. This was about control. Still, he pushed forward, refusing to be intimidated, until the morning he woke to find himself a prisoner in his own home. It had started with a sound, a low rhythmic thudding that did not belong, the kind of sound that wormed its way into consciousness even before he was fully awake. When he stepped outside, the air was thick with the scent of fresh mortar, and the source of the noise became horrifyingly clear. A wall. A brick wall was being built around his property, stretching high enough that it would soon block the view entirely. Workers in dark overalls moved methodically, stacking heavy bricks with quiet efficiency, their faces impassive as if they had done this 100 times before. He stared, struggling to process what he was seeing, the sheer absurdity of it. He had heard of neighbors feuding over fences, of homeowner associations enforcing ridiculous aesthetic rules, but this was something else entirely. This was deliberate. His first instinct was to stop them, but when he demanded to know what the hell they were doing, the response was infuriatingly bureaucratic. Just following orders, one of the workers muttered, barely sparing him a glance. Douglas's pulse pounded. Whose orders? This is my property. The man shrugged, nodding toward the neatly pinned permit attached to the fence. It's all approved. Talk to the board. Douglas ripped the paper down, scanning it with growing disbelief. His name was on the form. His signature was at the bottom. But he had never signed this. It was a forgery, and a damn good one at that. His breath came faster, his grip tightening on the paper as he turned toward Karen's house, where she stood at her window, watching with the serene satisfaction of someone who knew she had already won. He strode toward her, barely containing his rage. She stepped onto her porch before he could reach the door, her expression carefully composed. "Oh, Douglas," she sighed, shaking her head as if he were a troublesome child who had made a mess of things. "You forged my name," he said, voice low and tight. "This is illegal." Her smile didn't waver. "Oh, I think you'll find everything is quite in order. We have the paperwork to prove it. You really should be more careful with what you sign." "I never signed this." "That's a shame," she mused, tilting her head. "Because according to the city records you did." His hands clenched into fists. "I'll press charges." Karen's smile grew sharper. "You're welcome to try. But I'd be careful. People who don't respect the rules here tend to." Struggle, she gestured vaguely toward the street. "And from where I'm standing, you approved this wall yourself." A rush of fury threatened to overtake him, but he forced himself to stay calm. Losing his temper wouldn't help him now. He needed to be smart, needed to find out exactly what was happening. Because this wasn't just about an overzealous neighbor enforcing petty rules. This was something else. And he had a sinking feeling he was only beginning to understand just how deep it went. Douglas stood in his yard, gripping the fraudulent permit so tightly that the edges curled in his fingers. The brick wall now loomed above him, a structure so deliberate and imposing that it was impossible to mistake it for anything other than a message. This wasn't a simple property dispute or an overreach by the neighborhood board. This was a carefully orchestrated act designed to isolate him, to strip him of any control over his own home. The realization settled over him like a weight thick and suffocating. He walked the perimeter, running his hand along the rough, uneven surface of the wall. The mortar was still damp, the bricks solid and heavy beneath his palm. Whoever had done this had wasted no time, working through the night like a team executing a military operation. His mind raced through the possibilities. Who had actually ordered this? Who had signed off on something so outrageous? The forged permit suggested city involvement, but that didn't make sense. Even with Karen's influence, there was no way a construction project of this scale had been approved through official channels in such a short time. He needed answers. Now, his first instinct was to call the police, but a gnawing voice in the back of his head warned him that wouldn't get him anywhere. His previous encounters with the authorities had already shown him how little interest they had in his complaints. If they hadn't taken his concerns seriously when he'd reported the constant harassment, the missing permits, and the vandalized property, why would they care about a wall? They would probably treat it as a civil matter, tell him to take it up with the city, and leave it at that. He couldn't afford to waste time going in circles with red tape. Instead, he turned to the only option that made sense, going straight to the source. He crossed the street, barely restraining himself from breaking into a full stride as he approached Karen's house. The woman had been watching him from her window earlier, savoring his reaction like a predator watching trapped prey. Now, as he reached her front steps, the curtain twitched slightly before falling still. She had been expecting him. He rapped his knuckles against the door, each knock sharp and deliberate. Seconds passed, a minute. He was about to knock again when the door creaked open, revealing Karen standing there in a pale blue cardigan, holding a steaming cup of tea. She looked completely at ease, as if this were just another pleasant morning in her perfectly curated world. "Douglas," she greeted, her voice warm but with an unmistakable undercurrent of amusement. "I had a feeling I'd be seeing you today." "Cut the act," he said, his voice controlled but firm. "What the hell is going on?" Karen sighed, stepping aside and gesturing for him to enter. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping over the threshold. The inside of her house was just as pristine and suffocatingly perfect as the outside, decorated in neutral tones, every piece of furniture arranged with clinical precision. It smelled faintly of lavender and something else, something chemical and artificial that he couldn't quite place. She led him into the sitting room, where a single chair sat facing a bay window overlooking his house and the massive wall now enclosing it. It was positioned deliberately, as if she had spent hours just sitting there, watching his life be dismantled brick by brick. "I assume you're here about the construction," she said, settling into her chair and taking a slow sip of her tea. "You know damn well why I'm here," Douglas snapped. "Who approved this? Who forged my name?" Karen tilted her head, her expression one of almost childlike innocence. "Oh, Douglas, you always assume the worst," she set her cup down on a delicate porcelain saucer. "No one forged anything. The paperwork is completely legitimate. The city approved the project, and the necessary permissions were obtained. You really should be more careful with what you sign." His stomach turned. The calm certainty in her voice unsettled him more than outright denial would have. "I didn't sign anything," he said slowly, forcing himself to keep his voice level. "And I know damn well that no city office approved an illegal structure overnight." Karen gave a small, pitying smile. "You're thinking about this all wrong. You're acting as if this is some sort of conspiracy against you, when really it's just about maintaining order. We take care of our own here, Douglas, and that house your house, it's always been a bit problematic." Douglas stiffened. "Problematic." She folded her hands in her lap, studying him. "You're not the first person to try and fix that house. Others have come before you, with their grand ideas of restoration, of bringing it back to its former glory." She exhaled softly. "But they never last. Something always happens, they get overwhelmed, they leave. Some just disappear." His skin prickled. "Disappear." Karen shrugged, lifting her tea again. "The world moves fast. People come and go. Sometimes they make choices they regret." She took a sip, then added, "I just hope you make the right ones." Douglas clenched his fists, every instinct screaming at him to lash out, to grab her, to shake the truth out of her. But he forced himself to breathe, to think. He had come here for answers, and he wouldn't get them by losing control. He took a step back, his voice steady despite the anger boiling beneath the surface. "This isn't over." Karen smiled, unbothered. "Oh, Douglas, it never is." He turned and left, striding back to his house, the walls closing in around him in more ways than one. The rest of the day passed in a haze of frustration and dead ends. The city records office gave him the runaround, transferring his calls from one department to another, until he finally reached someone who actually bothered to look up the permit. But when they did, their answer sent ice through his veins. "We have no record of that construction project." What Douglas gripped the phone tighter. "That's impossible. The workers showed me a city-approved permit with my name on it." "I don't know what to tell you, sir. If there was an application, it's not in our system." He barely heard the rest of the conversation before hanging up. No records, no approvals. Yet the wall was real. That night, as he sat in his darkened house, staring at the brick barrier through his window, he knew one thing for certain. Karen wasn't just trying to control him. She was trying to erase him. Douglas spent the rest of the evening trying to make sense of what was happening. Every rational thought told him this was absurd, that a neighborhood committee, no matter how powerful, couldn't simply wall someone inside their own home. And yet, there it was, a solid brick wall, stretching around his property like a fortress, its mortar still damp from the rushed construction. The city claimed they had no record of the permit, yet the workers had shown him one with his name on it. The police would likely call it a civil dispute, telling him to hire a lawyer and take it to court, a process that could drag on for months while he remained effectively trapped. There had to be another way. His first thought was to simply knock the wall down. He had tools, sledgehammers, crowbars, everything he needed to tear it apart brick by brick. But something about Karen's demeanor, the way she had looked at him with that self-satisfied smirk, made him hesitate. This wasn't just about intimidation. There was something calculated about the way she operated, as if she already knew what steps he would take and had plans in place to counter them. Destroying the wall would likely trigger something worse, maybe an immediate police response, maybe some legal trap that would pin him as the aggressor. He needed to think this through. Instead, he spent the night gathering evidence. He took photos from every angle, documenting the wall's structure, the permits, even the cement still drying in the cracks. He checked the foundation, running his hands along the bottom layer of bricks, searching for any clue as to how deep it went. It was then that he noticed something odd. The bricks weren't new. The color was inconsistent, and as he brushed away the dust, he saw faded markings along the edges, barely visible beneath layers of grime. These bricks had been used before. He pried one loose, careful not to cause too much damage, and turned it over in his hands. There was an engraving on the side, nearly worn away with time. Westhaven. The name sent a jolt through him. He had seen it before, buried deep in the city records when he had researched the house's history. Westhaven had been the name of an old residential area on the outskirts of town, long since demolished to make way for new developments. The entire neighborhood had been wiped off the map decades ago, its residents relocated, their homes razed. But if these bricks came from there, that meant someone had been salvaging material from buildings that no longer existed. Why? And more importantly, why use them to build this wall? The realization left him uneasy, but he had no time to dwell on it. He needed to figure out a way out of this, and fast. Climbing the wall was out of the question. It was too high, too solid. But there was still one way out: the basement. When he had first moved in, he had noticed an old storm cellar at the back of the property, half buried beneath overgrown ivy and years of neglect. He hadn't paid much attention to it then, but now it could be his only escape route. He grabbed the flashlight and made his way down, pushing aside the clutter that had accumulated over the years. The heavy wooden doors groaned as he pried them open, revealing a narrow passageway leading underground. The air was thick with dust, the scent of damp earth filling his lungs as he stepped inside. The passage was older than the rest of the house, the walls lined with stone rather than brick. It was narrow, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through, and it seemed to lead beyond the perimeter of the wall. He moved cautiously, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness, illuminating the rough surface of the tunnel. It should have led to an exit point, an old storm drain, or an abandoned well, but after several minutes of walking, he found himself standing before something entirely unexpected. Another wall. Unlike the one above ground, this one was different. It was older, the bricks crumbling at the edges, the mortar cracked and flaking, and at its center, barely visible beneath layers of dirt and decay, was a door. Douglas hesitated, his fingers hovering over the rusted handle. The existence of this tunnel was strange enough, but the fact that someone had gone through the trouble of sealing off an underground passage meant that there was something on the other side they didn't want anyone to find. He tested the handle, but it wouldn't budge, rust and time having fused it shut. He stepped back, gripping the crowbar he had brought with him, and drove it into the gap between the door and the frame, prying with all his strength. The wood groaned in protest before finally giving way, the hinges snapping with a sharp crack. The space beyond was pitch black. He stepped inside, his flashlight revealing what looked like an abandoned room, its walls lined with wooden crates and rusted metal shelves. Papers littered the floor, yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. He picked up one of the documents, brushing off the dust. It was an old property deed dated 50 years ago. The name on it sent a chill down his spine. His address. He flipped through more papers, scanning the names. They were all property deeds, all listing homes that should have still existed, but many of them didn't. Some of the houses had been torn down, replaced by new developments, while others had simply vanished from city records. It was as if someone had been systematically erasing properties, removing any trace that they had ever been there. The pieces started falling into place. This wasn't just about Karen or the neighborhood board enforcing arbitrary rules. This was something bigger. The wall, the falsified records, the disappearing homeowners. Someone had been manipulating property ownership for decades, and his house was just the latest target. A noise echoed through the tunnel, snapping him out of his thoughts. Footsteps, slow, measured, coming from the entrance. Douglas killed the flashlight, pressing himself against the wall, his heart hammering in his chest. The steps grew closer, the sound of boots scraping against stone. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. They knew he was here. They had been waiting for him to find this place. A figure stepped into the faint glow of ambient light filtering through the cracks in the tunnel ceiling. Karen. She stood there, her expression unreadable, her hands folded neatly in front of her. "You really should have stayed inside, Douglas," she said, her voice calm, almost disappointed. He tightened his grip on the crowbar, his mind racing through his options. He could rush her, try to force his way past, but something about her stance, the quiet certainty in her eyes, told him that wouldn't work. She wasn't alone. She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You think you've uncovered some great mystery," she said, shaking her head. "But you're not the first, and you won't be the last. You've seen the records. You know what happens to people who don't belong." Douglas didn't move, his breathing slow and controlled. Karen smiled, tilting her head slightly. "The wall is just the beginning, then." Before he could react, the tunnel lights flickered on, revealing 3 more figures standing behind her. The exit was gone. Douglas had never considered himself an easy man to intimidate. He had spent years working in places most people would have deemed unsafe, crawling through the rotting beams of abandoned buildings, peeling back layers of history that others had chosen to forget. He had been in dangerous situations before: collapsed structures, unstable scaffolding, places where one wrong step meant disaster. But this was different. This wasn't about an old house fighting against time. This was deliberate. This was controlled. This was a game where he didn't know the rules, and worse, he didn't even know who was playing. The tunnel lights buzzed faintly, casting a dim, yellowish glow that flickered at the edges. Karen stood in front of him, her posture relaxed but her presence suffocating. Behind her, the 3 figures were motionless, their faces partially obscured by shadow. They weren't construction workers. They weren't city officials. They were something else entirely. Douglas kept his grip firm on the crowbar, but his mind was working faster than his hands. The fact that they hadn't moved, hadn't reacted, meant that either they didn't see him as a threat, or they wanted him to make the first move. Either way, it put him at a disadvantage. Karen let out a soft sigh, as if disappointed in him. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," she said, her voice carrying the kind of practiced patience reserved for misbehaving children. "All we've ever asked for is cooperation, but you just couldn't leave well enough alone, could you?" Douglas didn't answer. His eyes flicked to the documents scattered across the floor, the old deeds with names that had been scrubbed from the city's records. He had stumbled onto something bigger than a neighborhood dispute, bigger than Karen's petty need for control. The wall, the falsified permits, the disappearing houses. This was about erasure. Not just forcing people out, but making it so they had never been there to begin with. "You're going to fix this," Karen continued, stepping forward slowly. "You're going to walk out of here, and you're going to let this place be. Because I promise you, Douglas, you don't want to see what happens when people don't listen." Douglas let out a slow breath. If she was talking, she wasn't acting. That meant she still thought she could manipulate him, still thought she could scare him into compliance. But he had already come too far. He had already seen too much. Whatever this was, it had been going on for decades, maybe longer. The bricks in the wall above, salvaged from homes that no longer existed, the storm cellar that had led him here, the names on the papers. Someone had been pulling the strings of this neighborhood for a long time, and Karen was just the latest face of it. His fingers tightened around the crowbar, but he didn't lift it. If they wanted to force him out, they would have done it already. That meant they needed something from him. His compliance, his agreement, a signature maybe. That was their game. Everything had to look official. Everything had to look voluntary. They had erased people before, but not through brute force. They made them disappear on paper first. That was the real danger. Karen watched him carefully, as if waiting for him to say something, to break the silence, but he had nothing to say to her. Not yet. Instead, he let his gaze drift to the figures behind her, taking them in, memorizing the details. The way they stood, their posture too rigid, too controlled, the way they didn't speak, didn't react. Not hired muscle, not ordinary men. They were part of this machine, part of the system that had built the wall around his home, that had turned his name into something temporary, something that could be removed at will. The thought sent a surge of adrenaline through him. They wanted him to be afraid. They wanted him to feel trapped, but fear was a reaction, and he wasn't going to give them one. Instead, he forced himself to relax, loosening his grip on the crowbar just slightly, just enough to make it seem like he was considering her words. He needed time. He needed to think. He needed to understand exactly what they wanted from him before he made his move. Karen's lips curled into a knowing smile. "Good," she said softly, mistaking his hesitation for surrender. "I knew you were smarter than the others." She turned slightly, nodding to the figures behind her. One of them stepped forward, pulling something from the inside of his jacket, a thin, leather-bound folder. He held it out, and Douglas could see the crisp edges of paperwork inside, the glint of a gold-embossed seal at the top. It was official. Or at least, it looked official. "Sign it," Karen said simply. Douglas didn't reach for it. "What is it?" Her smile didn't waver. "A simple agreement. A reassignment of property rights. A voluntary transition." His stomach twisted. Voluntary. That was the key word. "This is how you do it, isn't it?" he said, keeping his voice level. "This is how you make people disappear. You don't just push them out, you make them erase themselves." Karen's eyes gleamed, a flicker of something sharp and dangerous behind the practiced veneer of civility. "That's a very dramatic way of putting it." Douglas let out a breath, glancing down at the folder. If he signed it, he had no doubt his name would vanish from the records within days. The house would no longer be his. And then, slowly, any trace that he had ever lived there at all would fade, just like the names on the documents littering the floor. He would become another story, another whisper, another name that people vaguely remembered before realizing they didn't remember it at all. But he wasn't going to sign. He had seen enough contracts in his time to know that everything came down to wording, to details. And he had learned something about Karen tonight. She didn't like mess. She didn't like things that didn't fit into neat, orderly boxes. The wall, the fake permits, the legal documentation, it was all meant to create the illusion of control. She needed his cooperation because without it, things became complicated. So he did the one thing she didn't expect. He laughed. He laughed. It was a low, humorless sound, but it had the intended effect. Karen's expression flickered, her confidence faltering for just a fraction of a second. "This is ridiculous," he said, shaking his head. "You think I'm just going to hand everything over because you shoved some paperwork in front of me?" He gestured to the wall of documents behind him. "That's what all of them thought, too, isn't it? That they had a choice, that they were walking away willingly." Karen's smile tightened. "You think you're the first person to fight back?" "No," Douglas admitted. "But I think I'm the first one who knows how to play the game." She studied him for a long moment, the silence stretching between them like a wire pulled too tight. The men behind her didn't move. They were waiting for her signal. Then finally she let out a small sigh, as if he had exhausted her patience. "You'll regret this," she said, not as a threat but as a promise. And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing in the tunnel, the unsigned contracts still resting on the table, the air thick with something that felt a lot like the weight of an unfinished story. Douglas stood in the dimly lit tunnel long after Karen and her silent entourage had left, his thoughts racing as he tried to process what had just happened. They had expected him to fold, to sign away his home, to let them erase him the way they had erased so many before. But he hadn't. And now the question wasn't whether they would come after him again, it was when and how. His pulse was steady, but beneath that calm was something sharper, something colder. He had spent his life restoring what others had tried to tear down, piecing together forgotten histories. And now he had stumbled onto a history that someone was desperate to keep buried. The weight of that realization settled over him as he turned his attention back to the documents strewn across the tunnel floor. Most of them were old property deeds, each listing names that no longer existed in the city's official records. Some of the addresses matched homes that were still standing, but others were gone bulldozed, replaced, absorbed into new developments. It was a pattern, a methodical erasure stretching back decades. But why? Why go through the trouble of making people disappear on paper before forcing them out? It wasn't just about acquiring land, it was about control, about reshaping the neighborhood into something carefully curated, something. unnatural. The deeper he looked, the more he felt like he was staring at the bones of something rotten beneath the surface of a perfectly manicured street. Douglas knew he couldn't stay down here much longer. The tunnel was cold, the walls pressing in, and every instinct told him that Karen's men wouldn't just let him walk away without consequences. He had to get out, regroup, figure out his next move before they made theirs. He retraced his steps through the passage, keeping his flashlight low, his ears straining for any sound that didn't belong. The way back felt longer, heavier, the knowledge he carried now making the walls seem tighter, the air thinner. By the time he reached the storm cellar doors and pushed them open, the night was thick and silent around him, the neighborhood draped in a stillness that felt almost staged. He moved carefully, checking the perimeter of his property. The brick wall stood undisturbed, the same silent threat it had been before. But there was something different now, something subtle that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. His house was too dark. The lights he had left on before going down into the tunnel were off. Not just the interior ones, everything. The security lights, the porch light, even the dim glow of the clock in the kitchen window. He knew the power hadn't gone out for the whole neighborhood because Karen's house across the street was still illuminated, casting its usual warm, artificial glow. This was targeted. A message. A warning. He stepped through his back door cautiously, the wooden floor creaking beneath his boots. The air inside was different, colder, almost sterile, like someone had opened all the windows to let the life seep out. He moved through the rooms methodically, checking for anything out of place, anything missing. But that was the thing. Nothing was missing. Everything was too in place. The disarray of his desk, where he had left open notebooks and scattered papers, had been neatly stacked. The dishes he had left in the sink were gone, the surfaces wiped clean. Even the rug in the living room had been subtly adjusted, perfectly aligned with the edges of the furniture. Someone had been here. And they hadn't come to steal. They had come to rearrange, to let him know that they could. A slow, controlled breath left his lungs as he pulled his phone from his pocket. No signal. He checked the router. Dead. Whatever they had done, they had cut him off in every possible way: electricity, internet. Even his landline had no dial tone. He was being boxed in, made to feel isolated, dependent on whatever move they allowed him to make next. But he had no intention of playing by their rules. If they thought shutting him down would make him more compliant, they were about to be disappointed. He grabbed his car keys and headed for the garage. If he couldn't call for help, he would drive out, get to someone who could actually do something. But the second he stepped into the garage, he stopped cold. His car was gone. Not broken into. Not vandalized. Just gone. The empty space where it had been parked was clean, almost surgically so, like it had never been there at all. He turned back toward the house, jaw clenched, muscles tensed, every nerve in his body screaming at him to expect the worst. And then, before he could take another step, a single sound cut through the silence. A phone ringing. Not his. He followed the sound, moving cautiously through the house, toward the living room. And there, sitting on the coffee table where nothing had been just minutes ago, was an old-fashioned rotary phone, beige plastic with a coiled cord that led to nowhere. It was ringing. His pulse slammed against his ribs, but he didn't reach for it. He let it ring. Once. Twice. 3 times. On the 4th, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse. Then a voice, low and calm, came through the air, not from the phone, but from his own house speakers. "You should have signed, Douglas." He didn't move. His own voice, recorded just hours ago, echoed from the speakers next. "This is how you make people disappear." Whoever had been here had been listening, recording, taking pieces of his life and playing them back to him as if to remind him that it no longer belonged to him. His hands curled into fists, his breath steady despite the ice settling in his veins. They were escalating, tightening the noose, seeing how far they could push before he broke. But they had underestimated him. He turned, heading straight for the basement. If they thought he was trapped, they were wrong. He hadn't spent years rebuilding things just to let someone else dismantle his life. If they had taken his car, cut his power, severed his connections, then he would find another way out. The tunnel was still there, waiting, a dark artery leading beneath the neighborhood. This time he wasn't just looking for answers. He was looking for leverage. He needed something they didn't want found, something that would force them to back off. And he had a feeling it was down there, buried beneath decades of carefully rewritten history. He grabbed a flashlight and stepped inside. The air was thick, unmoving, the weight of old stone pressing down on him as he moved deeper. He retraced his steps from before, past the scattered documents, past the sealed doorway. There had to be more. There had to be a reason they were so desperate to keep this place hidden. And then he saw it. A rusted metal filing cabinet, half buried under debris, its drawers locked but not impenetrable. He wedged the crowbar into the seam and pried it open, the metal groaning in protest. Inside were stacks of documents, but these weren't just property records. They were incident reports, pages filled with names, dates, details of voluntary departures that had been anything but voluntary. Some of the reports had photographs attached, grainy, black and white images of houses just like his, before they had been wiped from existence. One in particular made his stomach drop. A photo of his own house, dated 5 years before he had moved in, and beneath it, a name. Not his, not the previous owner's. Someone who was never listed in any public record. His blood ran cold. He wasn't the first person to live in that house. He was just the first one who was supposed to remember. Douglas had seen enough. The rusted metal cabinet, the carefully hidden reports, the grainy black and white photographs of houses that no longer existed. This wasn't just about his home. This wasn't about property disputes or neighborhood regulations. This was a system. A machine designed to erase people, to wipe them from records, to dismantle the very fabric of their existence piece by piece until there was nothing left, and he had been marked as the next to disappear. He flipped through the files rapidly, his breath steady but his pulse hammering in his throat. Some of the reports dated back decades, listing names that had long since been scrubbed from the city's archives. Others were newer, recent enough that the ink hadn't fully dried, recent enough that the people in them should still exist. But they didn't. He scanned the documents, noting a pattern. Each report followed the same process: initial complaints filed by the neighborhood board, legal notices, forged signatures, financial discrepancies appearing out of nowhere, utilities cut, communications severed. And then, finally, a voluntary departure. Only these people hadn't left. They had been erased. His fingers tightened around the paper, the edges curling as realization set in. He had thought Karen was the orchestrator, the one pulling the strings, but now he saw the truth: she was just another cog in the machine. She wasn't working alone. The board, the city offices that had ignored his complaints, the construction crews that had built the wall without hesitation, this went beyond her. And that meant he wasn't just fighting one person. He was fighting all of them. A noise from above made him freeze. The sound of movement, of deliberate footsteps echoing against the cold stone walls. He had been so focused on the documents that he hadn't heard them coming. He shut the file cabinet quickly, shoving the papers into his jacket. The flashlight beam trembled slightly as he turned toward the tunnel entrance, heart pounding against his ribs. He had planned to get out quietly, to take what he had found and figure out his next move. But that wasn't an option anymore. They were here, and they weren't trying to be subtle. The footsteps grew louder, the scrape of boots against concrete. Multiple people. He could hear the way they moved, slow, deliberate, controlled. They weren't searching for him. They knew exactly where he was. His options were limited. The tunnel only had 2 exits: the storm cellar, which they had likely already blocked, and the sealed door at the far end, the one he had broken open the first time he had come down here. He had no idea where it led beyond that first chamber, but he didn't have time to think. He moved quickly, keeping the flashlight beam low as he crossed the room, his mind running through possible scenarios. If they caught him here, he was done. There would be no police reports, no missing person alerts. He would simply stop existing. He slipped through the broken door, just as the first figure appeared in the tunnel's entrance. He didn't see their face, but he saw the beam of their flashlight sweep across the space he had just been standing in. They hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward, signaling the others behind them. They weren't in a hurry. They knew he had nowhere to go. Douglas moved faster, his breath measured, his footsteps careful against the damp ground. The new section of the tunnel was narrower, older, the walls rougher, lined with decaying wooden beams. The air smelled different here, heavier, like stagnant water and rust. He could hear them behind him, their movements deliberate, unhurried. They were pushing him forward, steering him toward whatever lay ahead. Then he saw it. A staircase. It was made of stone, uneven and crumbling, leading upward. Not toward his house, but somewhere else. Somewhere else. Somewhere outside the enclosed walls. His pulse quickened. If he could reach it, if he could get above ground, he might have a chance. He took the steps two at a time, ignoring the way they shifted beneath his weight, the sound of loose gravel skittering down into the darkness below. The air grew warmer as he climbed, the scent of damp earth replaced by something fresher outside air. He was close. He could feel it. Then, as he reached the top, he saw the door, and standing in front of it, waiting, was Karen. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't taunting him. She simply stood there, watching as he came to a halt, his breath sharp, his fists clenched. Behind him, the footsteps grew louder. They had closed the distance. Karen tilted her head slightly, eyes flicking to the papers stuffed into his jacket. "You should have signed." Douglas's jaw tightened. "That's not going to happen." She sighed, almost regretful. "You don't understand what you're doing." "I understand perfectly," he shot back. "I understand that I was never supposed to find this place. That none of them were." He nodded toward the documents. "But I did. And now you don't get to pretend it never happened." Her expression remained unreadable. "You think you can stop this?" "I think I can make it messy," he said evenly. "And I don't think you like mess." That made her pause. He saw it, the flicker of hesitation, the calculation. He wasn't wrong. Everything about this operation was designed to be clean, no forced removals, no police involvement, no bodies. Just people who chose to leave, who vanished without struggle. If he broke that pattern, if he forced their hand, it would bring attention. And attention was the last thing they wanted. Behind him, the figures had stopped. Waiting, Karen exhaled slowly. Then, without looking away, she stepped aside. The door was open. Douglas didn't hesitate. He moved past her, out into the night air, his body tense, waiting for a last-second betrayal. But none came. He was outside. But he wasn't safe. Karen's voice followed him as he stepped into the empty lot beyond the tunnel. "You can leave, Douglas. But it won't matter. You don't own that house anymore. You don't exist in the system. There's nowhere to go." He turned back, eyes sharp. "We'll see about that." She smiled then. Just slightly. "Yes, we will." And then the door shut. Douglas stood there for a long moment, the cold night air filling his lungs, his pulse still hammering in his ears. He knew this wasn't over. He had gotten out. But that was only because they had let him. They believed he had nowhere to turn, no way to fight back, but they were wrong. Because he still had the files. And if they thought they could erase him, they were about to find out just how much damage a man could do when he had nothing left to lose. Douglas didn't stop moving until he was well away from the tunnel entrance, his breath steady but his mind racing. He had expected them to drag him back, to make him disappear like all the others, but they hadn't. Karen had let him walk away, her voice trailing after him like an unfinished sentence. That alone told him everything he needed to know. She wasn't done with him yet. She thought she still had control, that even outside the wall, he had nowhere to go, no way to fight back. She believed that cutting him off from the system meant he was already gone. And that was her mistake. He needed to move fast. He didn't know how long it would take before they came after him again, before they tried to wipe away whatever traces of him still remained. The files were his only leverage, the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. If he lost them, if he hesitated, he would vanish just like the others. He pulled the papers from inside his jacket as he walked, skimming them under the glow of a distant street lamp. Addresses, names, official-looking forms stamped with falsified approvals. He had proof. More than enough to force a spotlight onto whatever the hell was happening here. But first, he needed to see if he still existed. The town wasn't far. He kept to side streets, avoiding main roads, keeping his head down. He didn't trust that they wouldn't be watching, that they wouldn't have someone waiting to intercept him the moment he made a move. He reached the city limits just before dawn, his pulse steady but his hands tight at his sides. He needed a phone, a computer, anything that could tell him whether his name, his home, his life were still real outside of that neighborhood. He found a rundown internet cafe just off the main road, the kind that opened early for the workers who passed through on their way to morning shifts. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee and warm electronics. He paid cash for a session, logging into a public computer with fingers that barely trembled. The first search was his own name. Nothing. Not an error. Not a misspelling. Just nothing. As if he had never existed in any records, as if his identity had been stripped away overnight. He tried his house next, the address that had belonged to him only yesterday. It came up but not under his name. The listing showed a new owner, the purchase finalized 3 weeks ago. A transaction that had never happened, signed by a man who didn't exist. His blood ran cold. They hadn't just removed him. They had replaced him. His fingers tightened against the keyboard. He needed a new plan. The files in his hands were proof, but proof meant nothing if the people in charge controlled every system that could verify it. He had assumed he could go to the police, to a lawyer, to someone who would recognize what was happening. But now, seeing the extent of their reach, he knew better. The city, the local government, the institutions meant to protect people, they were part of it. He was standing at the edge of a game he hadn't even known he was playing, and the only reason he was still breathing was because they believed they had already won. He needed someone who couldn't be bought, someone outside their network, someone they hadn't accounted for. His mind raced through possibilities, eliminating them as fast as they came. Friends? No. They would be monitored. The media? Too slow, too unreliable. But there was one thing Karen and her people hadn't erased. History. He reached into the stack of papers, pulling out the oldest deed he had found, the one with the name he didn't recognize. The original owner of his house, the person who had lived there before any records of the property had been scrubbed clean. If anyone had answers, it was them. If they were still alive. He ran another search, fingers steady even as his pulse climbed. The name came up, not much, but enough. A man now in his 70s, living 3 towns over in what looked like a run-down rental complex. Douglas memorized the address, logged out of the system, and left before anyone could take note of him. By the time he reached the old man's apartment, the sun had fully risen, washing the city in muted gold. The building was worn, the kind of place where people went to be forgotten. Douglas knocked once, then again, his patience hanging by a thread. He heard movement inside, slow and cautious, before the door creaked open. The man who stood before him was thinner than he had been in the grainy photo, his hair white, his face lined with the weight of too many years. His eyes flicked over Douglas once, sharp despite the age behind them. "You shouldn't be here," the old man said. Douglas didn't hesitate. He held up the file. "Neither should I." A long silence stretched between them. Then, with a sigh, the man stepped back, opening the door just wide enough to let him inside. The apartment was sparse, the furniture old, the curtains drawn tight. Douglas didn't waste time. He spread the documents out on the table, watching as the old man's expression darkened. "I know what they're doing," Douglas said. "I just don't know why the old man traced a finger over one of the papers," his jaw tightening. "They tried to do the same to me." Douglas leaned forward. "Why?" The man exhaled sharply. "Because that place isn't a neighborhood. It's a project. A controlled environment. A test." His eyes lifted, locking onto Douglas's. "And people like us? We're variables they don't want." Douglas frowned. "What kind of test?" The old man hesitated, then reached for a drawer, pulling out a yellowed piece of paper. A blueprint. Not of a house, but of the entire neighborhood. "They don't want homeowners," the old man said. "They want placeholders. People who follow rules, who don't ask questions. They build, they erase, they rebuild again. Every few years they wipe the slate clean. They replace owners, they reset history, and they make sure no one ever looks too closely. His fingers tightened around the edge of the blueprint. And if someone does, they disappear. Douglas finished. The old man nodded. Douglas exhaled, the weight of it all settling in his bones. He had spent his life restoring things, piecing together the past, and now he had become part of a history that wasn't meant to exist. He could run, he could disappear before they came for him again, or he could burn it all down. He met the old man's gaze. "How do we stop them?" A slow, grim smile spread across the man's face. "I thought you'd never ask."